In the heart of New Orleans, where the scent of magnolia blossoms mingled with the damp air of the bayou, young dancer Amara James carved out her existence. Her passion for movement pulsed through her veins like the rhythm of the city itself, unpredictable, vibrant, and alive. Amara had danced since she could remember, her feet always tapping to the unseen beat of the world around her. But for all the grace she displayed on stage, life off it was far less harmonious. She lived in a cramped apartment above a small corner store in the French Quarter, where the sounds of jazz filtered up through the thin walls, comforting her as she fell asleep each night. Her mother, a stern, protective woman named Naomi, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, one as a waitress in a local diner, the other as a cleaner for wealthy families. Naomi's hands, once elegant and smooth, were now rough and calloused, evidence of years spent scrubbing floors and washing dishes. Amara had never known a life of luxury. She didn't ask for much, just a chance to dance. But every day, her mother reminded her that dreams don't pay rent. You need a real job, girl. This dancing nonsense ain't gonna keep you fed, Naomi often said, her voice tinged with concern but wrapped in tough love. Amara's heart ached every time her mother said this, but she knew better than to argue. Naomi worked herself to the bone for their survival, and Amara was determined to make her proud, even if it meant dancing in the dimly lit clubs of Bourbon Street, where the tips were small but the crowds were loud. Her body ached from the long nights of rehearsals and performances, but she couldn't stop. Dance was her escape, her voice in a world that often felt too loud, too cruel. The streets of New Orleans were a jungle, alive with both beauty and danger, and Amara knew how to move through it. But even in the chaos, something darker had begun to stir in the city's shadows, something she could never have predicted. It started with the whispers. At first, they were soft, just murmurs on the wind, easily dismissed. But they grew louder, more persistent, until even Amara could feel them, a sensation creeping up her spine, a presence just beyond her reach. On a night that began like any other, Amara stepped out onto the stage of the small club where she performed regularly. The audience cheered, and she gave them her all, her body moving with precision and passion. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. The air grew heavier, colder, despite the heat of the crowded room. The familiar tune she danced to now seemed distorted, like a melody twisted in the wind. Amara paused mid-spin, her foot faltering on the floor, and for a split second, she saw it, a figure in the back corner, a shadow that seemed to move on its own. It wasn't a person, not really. It was something darker, something far older. And in that fleeting moment, Amara felt the blood drain from her face, her breath catching in her chest. There was no mistaking it now. The phantom had come. The night was still young, but Amara could no longer focus on the rhythm of the music. She tried to push the unsettling feeling from her mind, shaking off the haunting image of the shadow that had flickered in the corner. But the weight in the air only grew heavier, colder. Her body, which had once flowed effortlessly with the music, now felt stiff and awkward, as though something invisible was pulling at her, tugging her off balance. She tried to continue her routine, forcing her limbs to obey, but every move felt wrong. The phantom presence lingered like a thick fog, suffocating her thoughts. Her eyes darted nervously around the dimly lit room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing except the growing feeling that she was being watched. The audience, oblivious to her inner turmoil, clapped and cheered, mistaking her tremor for artistic flair. But Amara's heart raced, the beat of her chest matching the pounding rhythm of the music. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on her. The air seemed to crackle with static, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, it happened. As she spun once more, a chill ran through her like a gust of ice-cold wind. Her foot landed awkwardly, and she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. But that wasn't what made her freeze. It was the figure, tall and imposing, standing at the far side of the stage, barely visible in the shadows. A figure that hadn't been there a moment ago. Amara's pulse quickened, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she forgot where she was. She was back in the alley, back on the street corner where she had seen strange things before. But this was different, this was real, and the figure was right in front of her. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. His face was obscured by a hood, his body cloaked in darkness. The lights of the club barely touched him, casting an eerie glow around the edges of his form. He stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Amara's breath caught in her throat, her legs frozen in place as her instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't move. She couldn't even blink. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The music played on, but to Amara, it felt distant, as though she was submerged underwater. The figure took a single step forward, and she flinched, instinctively raising her arms to protect herself. But before she could react, the figure was gone, disappearing into the darkness like smoke in the wind. The coldness remained. The whispers began, low and menacing, slithering through the walls of the club like 100 voices speaking in unison. Amara staggered back, her breath shallow and erratic. What was this? What was happening to her? The audience was still clapping, still cheering, but Amara couldn't hear them anymore. She couldn't hear anything except the pounding of her heart, the whispers growing louder and louder. And then, the lights flickered, once, twice, 3 times, before going out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. A scream echoed from the back of the room, followed by another, and then the clattering of chairs. Panic spread like wildfire, and Amara felt a surge of terror unlike anything she had ever known. As her eyes adjusted to the blackness, she caught a glimpse of movement at the far end of the stage. The phantom was there again, his presence undeniable. She could feel him, his malevolent energy pressing down on her chest like a vice. This was no coincidence. The phantom had chosen her. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and confusion for Amara. After that night, she couldn't shake the phantom's presence. It was as if he was haunting her every waking moment, his cold shadow always lurking just out of sight. No matter where she went, whether on stage or off, she felt his gaze, a constant, oppressive weight that seemed to follow her every move. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her, the result of stress and too little sleep. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more it grew. Her practice sessions became a struggle. Every time she stepped onto the stage, her body betrayed her. Her muscles would stiffen at random moments, as though someone, or something, was pulling at her from within. The once fluidity of her movements became jagged, as if she was fighting against an invisible force. Each turn, each leap, each pirouette was like dragging herself through molasses, her body resisting the motion as though it had a mind of its own. The worst part was the cold. It wasn't just the chill in the air, it was the unnatural chill that seeped into her bones, settling deep in her chest, making it hard to breathe. The kind of cold you couldn't escape, no matter how many layers you put on. And then there were the voices. She heard them late at night, when the city was quiet and she was alone in her apartment. The whispers were soft at first, just barely audible, but then they grew louder, more insistent. They would call her name, their voices twisted and distorted, as if coming from a deep well. Amara, come. She would sit up in bed, wide-eyed, her heart thudding in her chest, but when she looked around, there was no one there. It was always the same. She would lie back down, shivering, staring at the ceiling, unable to shut her eyes without seeing that shadow in her mind. The phantom. It wasn't just the phantom's presence that was starting to affect her, it was everything around her. The people in her life seemed to notice something was off. Her mother, always strict and demanding, had begun to speak to her in sharp tones. Amara's once strong passion for dance was fading under the pressure. Her friends and fellow dancers seemed to notice too, but they didn't understand. How could they? Even the nights out on the streets of New Orleans, which once brought her a sense of freedom, now felt tainted. The vibrant city she had loved seemed darker, the the lively jazz music now a constant reminder of the phantom lurking in the shadows. Every corner she turned, every alleyway she passed, seemed to close in around her. One evening, after another failed practice session, Amara wandered the streets, lost in thought, trying to push the fear out of her mind. As she passed a familiar street, she saw a small, nondescript shop that she hadn't noticed before. Its sign was faded, barely legible, but something about it called to her, a strange, undeniable pull. She hesitated for a moment, but something deep inside urged her to go inside. The door creaked open, and a bell rang softly as she stepped inside. The air was thick with incense and the faint scent of sage. It was quiet here, too quiet, but the strange energy inside seemed to settle her nerves. An elderly woman, draped in layers of vibrant cloth, looked up from behind a small counter. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes, dark, knowing eyes, locked onto Amara's. "You've come," the woman said, her voice deep and steady, as if she had been waiting for Amara all along. Amara took a tentative step forward, her heart pounding. I don't know why I'm here." The woman smiled, a faint curve of her lips. "I do. You've been touched by the phantom." Amara froze. How could this woman know? She hadn't told anyone about the shadow, the coldness that had taken over her life. "Come," the woman said, gesturing for her to sit. "Sit, and I will tell you what you need to know." As Amara sat across from the woman, her mind raced. "What do you mean? Who is he?" The woman's eyes softened with understanding. "The phantom is a curse, a restless spirit tied to this city. His presence is born from pain, from the broken hearts of those lost to time. And now, he has chosen you." Amara shuddered, the weight of the woman's words sinking into her chest. "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get rid of him." The woman's gaze grew even more intense. "You cannot run from him. He is tied to this city, to your spirit. But there is a way to break the curse. You must dance, but not just any dance. You must perform a ritual, one that calls upon the very essence of New Orleans. It is the only way to free yourself." Amara's heart raced as the woman explained the steps of the ritual, the ancient dance that could sever the bond between her and the phantom. It would be difficult, dangerous, and the phantom would fight back with all his strength. But it was the only way to regain her freedom. The following day, Amara's mind was heavy with the woman's words. She barely slept that night, her thoughts swirling, each one darker than the last. The idea of performing some sort of ritual seemed surreal, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized it was her only hope. She had to break the connection with the phantom, or she would lose everything, her passion for dance, her sanity, and maybe even her life. She returned to the shop the next morning, eager to learn more. The elderly woman, Ms. Rosa, had promised to tell her the full story of the phantom, but she had warned her that it wasn't something to be taken lightly. "Sit," Ms. Rosa beckoned her, her voice steady and calm, as if she were speaking of an ancient truth. "The phantom you face is not just any spirit. His story is woven into the very fabric of New Orleans." Amara listened intently, her fingers gripping the edge of the table, as Ms. Rosa began to unravel the history that tied the phantom to the city. "Long ago, there was a man, an artist, a dancer just like you," Ms. Rosa said, her eyes distant, as though remembering a time long past. "His name was Isaac Du Bois. He was renowned in the city, a master of the dance. His movements were so graceful, so full of passion, that they captivated anyone who watched him. He had a lover, a woman from a poor family, but their love was forbidden. Isaac's family, rich and influential, did not approve of his relationship with someone of lower status. They tried to tear them apart, but Isaac and the woman, whose name was Marie, refused to let go." Amara sat forward, the story beginning to resonate deep within her. Isaac and Marie found a secret place, a theater long abandoned, deep within the heart of the city. They would dance there, in secret, away from the eyes of those who would disapprove. But their love was not meant to last. One fateful night, Isaac's family found out about their hidden sanctuary. In their rage, they stormed the theater, and in a brutal confrontation, Isaac was struck down. Marie tried to flee, but she was caught in the chaos, and both of them perished in that theater, their love lost to the shadows. Amara's throat tightened, and a chill ran down her spine as she imagined the tragedy. It was a story of love, betrayal, and death, an echo that had lingered in the very walls of New Orleans. Isaac's spirit, broken and furious, was bound to that place, to the city he once loved. But there was something more to his story, Ms. Rosa continued, her voice softening. Isaac's soul could not rest, not with his love unfulfilled. His anger grew, his sorrow deepened, and over time, he became the phantom you see today. His cursed spirit roams the streets of New Orleans, searching for someone to dance with, someone who could bring him peace. Amara's stomach nodded. So, he's been haunting the city for all this time. Ms. Rosa nodded. Yes. His ghost has been searching for someone with the passion, the talent, and the heart to release him from his torment. And that someone, my dear, is you. Amara felt the weight of the revelation sink deep into her chest. She had always felt connected to New Orleans, but now, hearing this story, it was as if she could feel the pull of the city's dark history. The phantom had chosen her, not just because of her dance, but because her heart, her spirit, was tied to his. But how could she break the curse that had been alive for so many years? How could she confront this angry, restless spirit without losing herself in the process? The following days were filled with an unrelenting sense of fear. Amara continued to practice the ritual dance that Ms. Rosa had taught her, but the pressure of the task weighed heavily on her. Each movement felt like a battle. It wasn't just the pressure to perform, it was the constant awareness of the phantom lurking around her, always just out of sight, watching, waiting. The energy around her seemed to crackle with tension, as though the very air was thick with anticipation. The phantom's presence became more pronounced, more aggressive. At times, she could hear him, his whispers calling her name, sometimes sweet, sometimes menacing. But it was always there, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. The closer she got to the final confrontation, the more unstable she felt. The ritual dance required her to open herself up, to connect with the spirit of Isaac, to allow his anger and sorrow to flow through her so she could use it to break his curse. It was a dangerous act, a way of calling the phantom to her, making herself vulnerable to the very thing she feared most. But what was the alternative? To keep running, to keep hiding from the truth? That would mean losing everything she had fought for, her art, her life, and her identity. One evening, after a particularly harrowing practice session, Amara sat alone in her apartment, her body aching with exhaustion. The phantom's presence was heavy, like a thick fog filling the room. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but in the darkness behind her closed eyelids, she saw him, Isaac. His figure was tall and imposing, his eyes filled with longing and pain. He was watching her, waiting. The voice in her head, low and insistent, echoed, "You are the one. You are the only one who can save us both." Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she felt a deep sense of dread and connection. She had to confront him. She had to end this.